The morning sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport as Major Sarah Chen made her way through the terminal, her civilian clothes doing little to disguise the disciplined posture that came from 15 years in the U.S. Army Special Forces. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat in 3 different theaters and lived to tell about it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and to any casual observer, she looked like just another business traveler heading to her gate. But Sarah was far from ordinary. As one of the first women to successfully complete the grueling Special Forces Qualification Course, she had earned her place among the elite Green Berets through sheer determination, exceptional skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Her specialty was counterterrorism and hostage rescue, and she had spent the better part of the last decade conducting classified operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. Today, however, she was supposed to be off duty. After completing a particularly challenging mission in Eastern Europe, Sarah had been granted 2 weeks of leave. She was flying to Los Angeles to visit her sister and meet her newborn nephew for the first time. It was a rare moment of normalcy in a life that had been defined by constant vigilance and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The passengers around her were a typical mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. In the seat to her left sat an elderly gentleman reading a newspaper, while to her right, a young mother was trying to keep her toddler entertained with coloring books. Behind her, she could hear 2 college students discussing their upcoming semester abroad. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly routine. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began reading a thriller novel, something she rarely had time for during active duty. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a real-life action hero, reading about fictional ones. But after years of living in a world where danger was always just around the corner, she found comfort in stories where the good guys always won and justice always prevailed. The passengers around her were a typical mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. In the seat to her left sat an elderly gentleman reading a newspaper, while to her right, a young mother was trying to keep her toddler entertained with coloring books. Behind her, she could hear 2 college students discussing their upcoming semester abroad. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly routine. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began reading a thriller novel, something she rarely had time for during active duty. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a real-life action hero, reading about fictional ones. But after years of living in a world where danger was always just around the corner, she found comfort in stories where the good guys always won and justice always prevailed. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstration, and Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 447 to Los Angeles. The weather was clear, he announced, and they would be cruising at 37,000 feet with an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 35 minutes. Sarah closed her eyes as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, letting herself relax for what felt like the first time in months. The takeoff was smooth, and within minutes they were climbing steadily into the crystal-clear Colorado sky. Sarah watched through the window as the Rocky Mountains grew smaller below them, their snow-capped peaks glinting in the morning sunlight. There was something almost meditative about flying, she reflected. Up here, removed from the chaos and complexity of the world below, it was easy to forget about the constant threats and challenges that defined her professional life. About 30 minutes into the flight, when the plane had reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had been turned off, Sarah noticed something that immediately triggered her instincts. 3 men, seated in different parts of the cabin, had all gotten up to use the restroom at roughly the same time. In itself, this wasn't unusual, except that Sarah had been unconsciously monitoring the passengers since boarding, as she always did, and she had noticed these 3 men exhibiting subtle signs of nervousness throughout the boarding process and takeoff. The first man, seated in row 8, was tall and thin with dark hair and a closely trimmed beard. He had been fidgeting constantly. checking his watch every few minutes and glancing around the cabin with the kind of awareness that suggested he was memorizing details rather than simply looking around out of boredom. The second man, in row 20, was shorter and stockier, with calloused hands that suggested manual labor, but his clothes were too new, too perfectly pressed, like a costume rather than everyday wear. The third man near the back of the plane was perhaps the most concerning of all. He had the lean, wiry build of someone in excellent physical condition, and despite his attempts to appear relaxed, Sarah could see the telltale signs of someone with combat training in the way he moved and positioned himself. Her pulse quickened slightly, but her expression remained calm and neutral. She had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of effective action, and if her suspicions were correct, she would need every advantage she could get. She continued to appear absorbed in her book while using her peripheral vision to track the movements of the three men. They had all converged near the front of the plane, ostensibly waiting for the restroom, but Sarah could see them exchanging subtle glances and hand signals. Her mind began running through possibilities and scenarios. If these men were planning something, and every instinct she had developed over 15 years of military service was screaming that they were, then she needed to be ready. She quickly assessed her resources. She was unarmed, as civilian flights required, but her body was a weapon honed by years of intensive training. She was also in an extremely confined space with limited maneuverability, which would work against her if a confrontation became inevitable. The elderly gentleman beside her had fallen asleep, and the young mother was still focused on entertaining her child. Neither of them had noticed anything unusual. In fact, looking around the cabin, Sarah realized that she was probably the only passenger who had picked up on the potential threat. The flight attendants were busy with their service preparations, and most passengers were either reading, sleeping, or staring out the windows.
Sarah discreetly reached into her carry-on bag and palmed her tactical pen, a seemingly innocent writing instrument that could be used as a weapon in the right hands. She also mentally cataloged other potential improvised weapons within reach: a hardcover book that could be used to strike pressure points, the heavy metal water bottle in the seat pocket, even the safety demonstration card that could be rolled into a rigid striking tool. The three men were taking longer than normal near the restroom, and Sarah could see them having what appeared to be a whispered conversation. One of them, the tall, thin man from row 8, kept checking his watch. If they were planning something, it seemed like they were waiting for a specific time or signal. Sarah's training kicked into high gear. She began mentally mapping the aircraft, identifying potential choke points, escape routes, and tactical advantages. The narrow aisle would force any confrontation into a linear battlefield, which could work for or against her, depending on how events unfolded. The emergency exits were clearly marked, but at 37,000 feet, they weren't really options. Her best bet, if trouble started, would be to neutralize the threats quickly and decisively before they could implement whatever plan they had in mind. As she watched, one of the men, the stocky one from row 20, began walking back toward his seat, but instead of sitting down, he stopped at row 15 and began talking to another passenger. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see that the passenger, a middle-aged businessman, looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. The man was gesturing toward the front of the plane, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that he might be identifying potential targets or gathering information about the passengers. The situation was escalating faster than Sarah had anticipated. As she continued to observe while maintaining her facade of reading, the pieces of what appeared to be a carefully planned operation began falling into place. The third man, the one with obvious combat training, had positioned himself near the rear of the aircraft, where he could monitor the back half of the passenger cabin. Meanwhile, the tall, thin man was still lingering near the front restrooms, but his attention had shifted to watching the cockpit door. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. In the post-9/11 era, aircraft security had been dramatically enhanced, but determined hijackers could still potentially overcome those defenses if they were well organized and willing to accept casualties. The fact that these three men had managed to coordinate their actions so far suggested a level of planning and preparation that made them extremely dangerous.
The stocky man who had been talking to the businessman in row 15 was now moving again, this time heading toward the front of the plane. As he passed Sarah's row, she got a better look at him and noticed details that confirmed her worst fears. Despite his attempts to blend in, she could see the outline of what appeared to be a makeshift weapon concealed in his waistband, probably something ceramic or plastic that had made it through security screening. His movements were too purposeful, too controlled, lacking the casual randomness of a normal passenger. Sarah realized she was likely witnessing the final preparation phase of a hijacking attempt. The three men had spent the first part of the flight assessing the cabin, identifying potential threats and obstacles, and now they were moving into position for whatever they had planned. She estimated that they had perhaps minutes, maybe less, before they made their move. The challenge she faced was enormous. Even with her extensive training and combat experience, taking on three potentially armed hijackers in the confined space of an aircraft cabin would be incredibly difficult and dangerous. There were innocent passengers to consider. Any confrontation would put them at risk. But if she did nothing and allowed the hijackers to seize control of the aircraft, the consequences could be catastrophic for everyone on board. Sarah made a calculated decision. She needed more information before she could act effectively, and she needed to position herself for maximum tactical advantage. She closed her book and stood up, stretching casually as if she had been sitting too long. This gave her an excuse to look around the cabin more openly and assess the current positions of all three suspects. The man near the rear had noticed her standing and was watching her with the kind of focused attention that confirmed he had at least some training in surveillance and threat assessment. Sarah met his gaze briefly with the politely neutral expression of a fellow passenger, then looked away, but not before noting that his right hand had moved slightly toward his waistband. He was definitely armed. Moving with the unhurried pace of someone heading to the restroom, Sarah began walking toward the front of the aircraft. This would take her past two of the three suspects and give her a better understanding of their positioning and equipment. As she approached row 8, where the tall, thin man had been sitting, she noticed that his seat was empty, but his jacket was still draped over the armrest. There was a suspicious bulge in one of the jacket's pockets that could have been another improvised weapon. The stocky man was now standing near row 6, pretending to retrieve something from the overhead compartment, but clearly focused on watching the passengers and flight attendants. As Sarah passed him, she caught a glimpse of what looked like a sharpened piece of metal or plastic concealed in his sleeve, crude but potentially effective in the close quarters of an aircraft cabin. Near the front restroom, the tall man was still lingering, but his attention was now completely focused on the cockpit door. Sarah realized that their plan was probably following a classic hijacking pattern: create a distraction or emergency that would force the cockpit door to be opened, then rush the flight deck and seize control of the aircraft. Once they had control of the plane, they would have ultimate leverage over everyone on board. As Sarah waited her turn for the restroom, she used the opportunity to study the cockpit door and the area around it. The post-9/11 security enhancements were clearly visible: the reinforced door, the security camera, and the communication system that allowed the flight crew to monitor the cabin. But she also knew that these defenses could be overcome if the hijackers were willing to create enough chaos or threaten enough lives to force the crew's hand. The tall man was checking his watch again, and Sarah realized that whatever they were planning was probably timed to coincide with a specific point in the flight, perhaps when they were over a major population center, or when they would have limited fuel for extended negotiations. She estimated that they had been in the air for about 45 minutes, which meant they were probably somewhere over the Colorado-Utah border, still well within range of multiple major cities. When Sarah entered the restroom, she took the opportunity to quickly assess her options. The confined space of the aircraft meant that any confrontation would be brutal and close quarters. Her training in Krav Maga and other combat systems would be invaluable, but she would need to be strategic about when and how she engaged. Taking on all three simultaneously would be nearly impossible. She would need to isolate and neutralize them one at a time. She also realized that she couldn't count on help from the other passengers. Most civilian air travelers had no combat training and would likely freeze or panic if violence erupted. The flight attendants were trained in emergency procedures, but not in dealing with armed hijackers. The pilots were locked in the cockpit and might not even be aware of the threat developing in the cabin. As Sarah prepared to return to the cabin, she heard a commotion outside the restroom door. Through the thin walls, she could hear raised voices and what sounded like someone crying out in alarm. Her worst fears were being realized. The hijackers were making their move, and they had chosen now, while she was trapped in the restroom, to begin their assault. She quickly opened the door and immediately assessed the situation. The stocky man was holding what appeared to be a sharpened plastic blade against the throat of a flight attendant, while the tall man was shouting demands at the cockpit door. The third hijacker, the one with combat training, was moving down the aisle, apparently trying to control the passengers and prevent anyone from interfering. The cabin had erupted into chaos. Passengers were screaming, some trying to duck down in their seats while others were standing up to see what was happening. Children were crying, and Sarah could hear at least one person frantically trying to make a phone call, probably to report the emergency to authorities on the ground. "Nobody move," the tall hijacker was shouting. "We control this aircraft now. Anyone who interferes will be killed." The flight attendant being held hostage was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, and Sarah could see the terror in her eyes. The plastic blade at her throat was crude but effective. Even a makeshift weapon could cause fatal injuries if used with sufficient force. "Open the cockpit door," the hijacker continued, pressing his weapon closer to the attendant's neck. "Open it now or she dies!" Sarah realized that this was her moment. The hijackers were focused on their immediate objectives and hadn't yet established complete control over the cabin. If she was going to act, it had to be now, before they could consolidate their position and make any counteraction impossible. But she also knew that her next few seconds of decision-making could determine whether everyone on the plane lived or died. One wrong move could trigger a massacre, but doing nothing would likely lead to an even worse outcome. Drawing on 15 years of training and combat experience, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would give them the best chance of survival. The hijacker with combat training was now only a few rows away from her position, barking orders at terrified passengers to stay in their seats. He hadn't yet noticed that Sarah was standing near the restroom, which gave her a crucial element of surprise. Behind him, she could see that several passengers had their phones out, probably trying to contact authorities, but she knew that help from the ground was still hours away at best. Sarah's training told her that the key to success in this situation would be speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence of action. She would have one chance to turn the tide, and if she failed, everyone on board would pay the price for her miscalculation. Sarah's combat instincts took over as she rapidly analyzed the tactical situation unfolding before her. The hijacker, with obvious military training, was now just 2 rows away, his attention focused on intimidating a group of businessmen who were huddled together near the window seats. His body language and movement patterns confirmed her earlier assessment. He definitely had combat experience, probably military or paramilitary training, which made him the most dangerous of the 3. The element of surprise was her greatest advantage, but it wouldn't last long. Within seconds, one of the hijackers would notice her position near the restroom and her opportunity would be lost. Sarah made her decision with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through dozens of high-stakes missions. She would take down the nearest threat first, using maximum force and speed to prevent him from alerting his accomplices. The combat-trained hijacker was now passing row 10, his back partially turned to Sarah as he gestured threateningly at an elderly passenger who was trying to shield his wife. Sarah could see that he had something in his right hand, probably another improvised blade, and his left hand was positioned near his waistband where he likely had a backup weapon concealed. Moving with the fluid precision of a predator, Sarah stepped out of the restroom area and began closing the distance to her target. Her footsteps were silent on the aircraft carpet, and she used the ambient noise of panicking passengers to mask her approach. The tactical pen in her right hand felt comfortable and familiar. She had trained with similar weapons hundreds of times, and she knew exactly where and how to strike for maximum effect. When she was within striking distance, the hijacker suddenly sensed her presence and began to turn. But Sarah was already in motion, her body committed to the attack. Her left hand shot out to grab his wrist and control the weapon, while her right hand drove the tactical pen toward the nerve cluster at the base of his neck with devastating precision. The strike was perfectly executed, hitting the brachial plexus and causing immediate temporary paralysis of the hijacker's right arm. He gasped in shock and pain, his improvised weapon clattering to the floor as Sarah continued her assault. Her knee came up hard into his solar plexus, doubling him over and forcing the air from his lungs. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, but it was devastatingly effective. The hijacker collapsed to his knees, struggling to breathe and unable to use his right arm. Sarah immediately pivoted to assess the positions of the other 2 hijackers, knowing that her surprise attack had likely alerted them to her presence. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The stocky hijacker holding the flight attendant hostage had indeed noticed the commotion behind him. He was shouting something in what sounded like Arabic or Farsi, probably alerting his tall accomplice that their operation was being compromised. The flight attendant was crying, the plastic blade still pressed against her throat, as her captor tried to maintain control of his hostage while dealing with this unexpected development. "Stay back," the stocky hijacker yelled at Sarah, his accent thick, but his English clear. "Stay back or I kill her." The tall hijacker near the cockpit door was also turning to assess the situation, his own weapon now visible in his hand. Sarah could see him calculating options, trying to decide whether to continue with the original plan or adapt to this new threat. The cockpit door remained securely closed, but Sarah knew that if the hijackers managed to create enough chaos or credible threat to passenger lives, the pilots might be forced to open it. "You made big mistake, lady," the stocky hijacker continued, pressing his blade more firmly against the flight attendant's throat. A thin line of blood appeared where the improvised blade had broken the skin. "Now she dies because of you." Sarah's mind was working at lightning speed, processing multiple variables and potential outcomes. She had successfully neutralized one of the 3 hijackers, but the other 2 were still armed and dangerous. More critically, they now held a hostage whose life hung in the balance. Any aggressive move on Sarah's part could result in the flight attendant's death. But Sarah also recognized that the hijackers' original plan had been disrupted. They had expected to seize control of the aircraft through surprise and intimidation, but now they were facing organized resistance. This changed the entire dynamic of the situation and gave her opportunities that didn't exist just minutes earlier. "Let her go," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Your plan has failed. Release the hostage and we can end this without anyone getting hurt." The tall hijacker near the cockpit door was speaking rapidly in the same foreign language, probably coordinating with his partner. Sarah caught enough fragments to confirm her suspicion that they were speaking Arabic, and their body language suggested they were arguing about their next course of action. The combat-trained hijacker she had taken down was beginning to recover from the nerve strike, flexing his fingers as feeling returned to his arm. Sarah knew she had perhaps 60 seconds before he would be capable of rejoining the fight, which meant she needed to resolve the hostage situation quickly or risk facing multiple opponents simultaneously. "You are military," the stocky hijacker said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sarah's stance and demeanor. "Special Forces, yes? We know about American women warriors, but you are outnumbered and we have nothing to lose." Sarah realized that these weren't common criminals or opportunistic terrorists. They were trained operatives who had done their homework about potential threats they might encounter. The fact that they had recognized her military background so quickly suggested they were part of a larger, more sophisticated organization. "Maybe," Sarah replied evenly, "but I'm not the one holding a hostage. That makes you the desperate one, not me." The psychological dynamics of the situation were as important as the physical ones. Sarah knew that hijackers thrived on fear and control, but once that control was challenged, they often made mistakes. Her job was to exploit those mistakes while minimizing the risk to innocent passengers. The tall hijacker had finished his conversation with his partner and was now moving closer, his weapon held in a way that suggested he knew how to use it effectively. Sarah found herself facing a classic tactical dilemma. Two armed opponents, one of whom held a hostage, in an enclosed space filled with innocent civilians. Behind her, she could hear the hijacker she had taken down starting to get back to his feet. His breathing was still labored, but he was recovering faster than she had hoped. Within minutes, she would be facing 3 opponents again, but this time they would be alert to her capabilities and less likely to underestimate her. The passengers around them were frozen in terror, some crying, others trying to make themselves invisible in their seats. Sarah knew that by now air traffic control was probably aware that something was wrong, but help was still hours away. "Last chance," the stocky hijacker said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You move away or I cut her throat, and we kill everyone on this plane." Sarah studied the hijacker's eyes and body language, using skills developed through years of interrogating captured enemies. She could see desperation there, but also determination. These men had committed to a course of action that they probably knew was likely to end in their deaths, which made them extraordinarily dangerous. But Sarah had faced desperate enemies before, and she had learned that even the most determined terrorists could be defeated if you understood their psychology and exploited their weaknesses. These hijackers had trained for resistance, but they had trained to face panicked civilians and overwhelmed security personnel, not a special forces operative with 15 years of combat experience. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. She could see it in the hijackers' eyes. They were about to escalate the situation, probably by harming the hostage to demonstrate their resolve. Once they crossed that line, the dynamic would shift dramatically and her options would become much more limited. Drawing on every lesson learned in combat zones around the world, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would give her the best chance of saving the flight attendant and regaining control of the aircraft. It would require split-second timing, absolute precision, and a level of violent action that most people couldn't imagine. But as she prepared to put her plan into motion, Sarah reflected on the words that had been drilled into her during Special Forces training. The impossible is just an opinion. At 37,000 feet, surrounded by terrified passengers and facing 3 armed hijackers, she was about to prove that sometimes the impossible was exactly what the situation demanded.
The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point as Sarah calculated her next move. The stocky hijacker's blade pressed harder against the flight attendant's throat, drawing another thin line of blood. The young woman's eyes were wide with terror, but Sarah noticed she was trying to remain as still as possible. Intelligent self-preservation that might just save her life. "You have 5 seconds to decide," the hijacker snarled. "Move away or watch her die." Sarah's eyes flicked to the tall hijacker, who was now positioned about 8 feet away, his makeshift weapon held in an experienced grip. Behind her, she could hear the 3rd hijacker, struggling to his feet, cursing in Arabic as he fought off the effects of her nerve strike. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Sarah had faced worse odds in Afghanistan and Iraq. What the hijackers didn't understand was that Sarah's Special Forces training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario. She had spent countless hours in kill houses and training facilities, practicing hostage rescue operations until her responses became instinctive. More importantly, she had learned to think several moves ahead, like a chess master anticipating her opponent's strategy. "Okay," Sarah said, raising her hands in an apparent gesture of surrender. "I win. I'm backing away." She took a small step backwards, her movements slow and deliberate. The stocky hijacker's grip on the flight attendant relaxed slightly, the first mistake Sarah had been waiting for. Simultaneously, she noticed that the tall hijacker had shifted his weight forward, preparing to advance and secure control of the situation, his second mistake. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion that most of the passengers would later struggle to describe coherently. Sarah's apparent retreat was actually the beginning of a complex tactical maneuver she had perfected during her time with the 5th Special Forces Group.
As her right foot stepped back, her left hand was already moving toward the emergency oxygen mask panel above the nearest seat row. In one fluid motion, Sarah yanked down the oxygen mask panel, creating a momentary distraction as the yellow masks tumbled down throughout the cabin. The sudden movement and noise caused both hijackers to instinctively look up for a split second, exactly what Sarah had counted on. During that crucial moment of divided attention, Sarah launched herself forward in a controlled dive that took her under the tall hijacker's weapon arc, while simultaneously putting her within striking range of the stocky hijacker holding the hostage. Her years of close-quarters combat training had taught her that, in confined spaces, low attacks were often the most effective because they were harder to counter. Her shoulder connected with the stocky hijacker's knees in a perfect tackle, the impact driving him backward and away from the flight attendant. The force of the collision sent him crashing into the galley wall, his improvised weapon flying from his grasp as he struggled to maintain his balance. The flight attendant, suddenly free, stumbled forward and collapsed to her knees, gasping and crying with relief. Blood from the cuts on her throat stained her uniform, but Sarah could see that the wounds were superficial, painful but not life-threatening. Before the tall hijacker could react to this rapid change in the tactical situation, Sarah was already pivoting to address the new threat. Her combat training had taught her never to commit fully to one target when multiple enemies were present, and she smoothly transitioned from her tackle into a defensive crouch that put her in position to engage the next threat. The tall hijacker was recovering from his momentary surprise and moving to attack, but his positioning in the narrow aisle limited his options. Sarah recognized the tactical advantage this gave her. In the confined space of the aircraft cabin, superior technique mattered more than size or strength. As he thrust his weapon toward her, Sarah executed a textbook deflection, using her arm force to direct his strike while simultaneously countering with an elbow strike to his solar plexus. The blow connected solidly, causing him to double over in pain, and creating an opening for Sarah to seize control of his weapon. Her hand clamped down on his wrist like a vice, applying pressure to specific nerve points that immediately weakened his grip. The improvised blade fell to the cabin floor with a metallic clatter, joining the weapons from his accomplices. Behind her, she could hear the third hijacker, the one she had initially taken down, finally getting back into the fight. But she also heard something else that gave her hope, the sound of other passengers beginning to move. Her actions had broken the spell of terror that had paralyzed the cabin, and people were starting to realize that the hijackers could be defeated. "Help me," Sarah called out to the passengers. "They're not superhuman, they're just 3 men with makeshift weapons." A businessman from row 14, a large man who looked like he might have played football in college, stood up and began moving forward. He was followed by 2 other male passengers, their faces grim with determination. The hijackers' era of invincibility was crumbling as the passengers realized they vastly outnumbered their captors.
The stocky hijacker, still dazed from Sarah's tackle, was trying to get back to his feet while simultaneously reaching for what appeared to be a backup weapon concealed in his sock. Sarah saw the movement and reacted instantly, delivering a precise kick to his wrist that sent the small blade skittering across the cabin floor. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in combat situations. The tall hijacker, still bent over from her elbow strike, was gasping for breath and seemed temporarily out of the fight. That left the third hijacker, who had finally recovered enough to rejoin the battle. But now he was facing not just Sarah, but several angry passengers who had realized they didn't have to be victims. The psychological tide of the confrontation had turned completely. What had begun as a carefully planned hijacking was now devolving into chaos for the terrorists, while Sarah found herself leading an improvised resistance that was gaining momentum by the minute. "The flight attendants!" Sarah shouted to the passengers who were moving to help. "Get them to safety first, then we'll secure these 3. The young flight attendant Sarah had rescued was being helped to her feet by a female passenger who appeared to be a nurse, judging by her competent assessment of the neck wounds. 2 other flight attendants who had been hiding in the rear galley were now emerging, their faces pale but determined to help regain control of their aircraft.
Sarah realized that the most critical phase of the confrontation was now beginning. They had disrupted the hijackers' plan and prevented them from seizing control of the cockpit. But the terrorists were likely to become even more desperate and dangerous as they realized their mission was failing. The third hijacker, now back on his feet, but clearly still affected by Sarah's initial assault, was reaching into his jacket for what was probably his most serious weapon, something he had held in reserve for exactly this type of emergency. Sarah could see the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who knew he was facing capture or death, and was prepared to take as many innocent people with him as possible. "Everyone get back!" Sarah warned, recognizing the change in the hijacker's demeanor. "He's going for a serious weapon!" The passengers who had been moving forward immediately stopped and began backing away, trusting Sarah's combat experience to guide them. But Sarah knew that retreat wasn't an option. If the hijacker managed to deploy whatever weapon he was reaching for, he could regain control of the situation and turn their victory into a massacre. Drawing on reserves of speed and aggression that had been honed through years of life-or-death situations, Sarah launched herself across the cabin in a final, desperate assault. She had one chance to stop the hijacker before he could bring his ultimate weapon to bear, and she committed everything to that single moment of action. The collision sent both of them crashing into the seats on the left side of the cabin, passengers diving out of the way as the two trained fighters grappled for control. Sarah's hands locked onto the hijacker's wrists, preventing him from completing his reach for the concealed weapon while she tried to position herself for a finishing strike. But this hijacker was stronger and more skilled than his companions, and Sarah quickly realized she was in for the fight of her life. His training was evident in every move he made, every counter to her attacks, every attempt to gain a dominant position in their deadly struggle. As they fought in the narrow confines between the seat rows, Sarah's mind flashed back to her instructors at Fort Bragg, who had always emphasized that victory in close combat came down to who wanted to survive more. Looking into the cold eyes of the man trying to kill her, Sarah made a silent promise. She would survive, and she would make sure everyone else on this plane survived with her. The battle for Flight 447 was far from over.
The grappling match between Sarah and the lead hijacker intensified as they crashed between the seat rows, their struggle taking on the desperate intensity of two highly trained fighters who both understood that only one of them would walk away from this confrontation. The hijacker's hands were still reaching for his concealed weapon, while Sarah fought to maintain her grip on his wrists and prevent him from accessing whatever final surprise he had planned. Passengers in the immediate area had pressed themselves back against the windows, giving the two combatants as much room as possible in the cramped confines of the aircraft cabin. Sarah could hear someone crying, the sound of rapid Arabic conversation from one of the other hijackers, and the underlying hum of the aircraft engines that reminded everyone they were still 7 miles above the earth with nowhere to run. The lead hijacker was stronger than Sarah had initially estimated, his lean frame hiding the kind of wiry strength that came from years of military training and constant physical conditioning. She could feel the muscles in his arms like steel cables as he fought to break free from her grip, and she realized that she was facing someone with combat experience comparable to her own. "American bitch," he snarled in accented English, his face inches from hers as they struggled. "You think you can stop the will of Allah?" Sarah didn't waste breath on a response. Instead, she shifted her weight and attempted to drive her knee into his midsection, but he twisted at the last second and her strike only glanced off his hip. His counterattack came immediately, a vicious headbutt aimed at her nose that she barely managed to deflect by turning her head. The partial impact still sent stars across her vision, and she felt her grip on his left wrist weaken momentarily. That was all the opening he needed to partially free his hand and resume his desperate reach for the concealed weapon. Sarah could feel his fingers brushing against whatever was hidden in his jacket, and she knew she had seconds before the tactical situation shifted dramatically in his favor.
Drawing on techniques learned in hand-to-hand combat courses at Fort Bragg, Sarah released her grip on his right wrist and immediately drove her thumb into the pressure point just below his left ear. The nerve strike sent a shock of pain through his system, causing his back to arch involuntarily and creating the opening Sarah needed. She rolled away from him and sprang to her feet, putting distance between herself and whatever weapon he was carrying. But instead of pressing her attack, she took a step back and assumed a defensive stance, her hands raised and ready to react to whatever he might produce. The hijacker also regained his feet, his hand now clearly gripping something inside his jacket. His two companions, the stocky one who had held the flight attendant hostage and the tall, thin one, were also back up, though both appeared to be nursing injuries from their earlier encounters with Sarah. The three terrorists quickly reformed their group, presenting a united front against the passengers and flight crew. "Now you see," the lead hijacker said, his voice carrying a note of triumph as he slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket. "Now you understand that we came prepared for resistance." What he revealed made several passengers gasp in horror. It wasn't a conventional weapon, but something far more terrifying in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. A small device that looked suspiciously like an improvised explosive. Sarah's training in bomb disposal allowed her to recognize the telltale signs: wires, a small LED display showing numbers, and what appeared to be a trigger mechanism that the hijacker now held in his other hand. "Suicide vest?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm despite the churning in her stomach. "Better," the hijacker replied with a cold smile. "This aircraft becomes a missile, pointed at the heart of America. But first you and all these people will die, unless the pilots open that door and give us control." The psychological impact on the passengers was immediate and devastating. The brief hope that had emerged when Sarah began fighting back evaporated as people realized they were now facing a threat that could kill everyone aboard regardless of how the physical confrontation played out. Several people began crying openly, while others frantically tried to call or text loved ones on their phones. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. If the hijacker really did have an explosive device, then her options had just become severely limited. She couldn't risk a direct assault that might trigger the device, but she also couldn't allow the hijackers to regain control of the situation and potentially turn the aircraft into a weapon against targets on the ground. "You're bluffing," Sarah said, though she didn't entirely believe it herself. "If you had a real explosive, you would have used it already instead of playing with improvised knives." The hijacker's smile widened. "You think like a soldier, but not like a martyr. We did not come here to die quickly. We came to complete a mission that will be remembered for generations. But if you force our hand..." His thumb moved closer to what appeared to be the trigger mechanism, and Sarah saw several passengers flinch. The flight attendant she had rescued was now sitting in an empty seat, with a makeshift bandage around her throat, watching the confrontation with wide eyes.
Sarah realized that she was facing a classic terrorist strategy, the use of overwhelming threat to paralyze opposition and create compliance through fear. But her Special Forces training had included extensive instruction in dealing with exactly this type of psychological warfare. The key was to maintain initiative and keep the terrorists reacting to her moves rather than allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. "What's your mission?" Sarah asked, taking a half step closer despite the apparent threat. "What could be worth killing all these innocent people?" "You will learn soon enough," the hijacker replied. "When the towers of American capitalism burn again, you will understand that today was just the beginning." The reference to the September 11th attacks sent a chill through the cabin that Sarah could actually feel. These weren't random terrorists or opportunistic criminals. They were part of a larger plot that was apparently targeting major American cities. The stakes of stopping them had just risen exponentially. Behind the hijackers, Sarah noticed that one of the flight attendants was making subtle hand gestures toward the cockpit door. She was probably trying to communicate with the pilots, letting them know about the explosive threat. That was both good and bad. Good because the flight crew needed to know what they were facing, but bad because it might prompt them to make decisions based on incomplete information. "The pilots are not opening that door," Sarah stated with absolute certainty.
Post 9/11 protocols mean they'll fly this plane into the ground before they'll let you into that cockpit. Then everyone dies, the stocky hijacker interjected, speaking English for the first time. But our mission still succeeds. This aircraft becomes a weapon, whether we control it or not. Sarah suddenly understood the true horror of their plan. They didn't necessarily need to seize control of the aircraft to achieve their objectives. Simply creating enough chaos and credible threat to passenger lives would force the pilots to consider emergency landings or other actions that could serve the terrorists' purposes. And if the situation deteriorated completely, the aircraft itself could become a weapon through impact or explosion. The lead hijacker was watching her face carefully, obviously trying to gauge her reaction to his revelations. Sarah maintained her composed expression, but inside she was rapidly recalculating her options based on this new understanding of their strategy. "You're thinking," he observed with satisfaction. "Good. Now you begin to understand that your American military training cannot save you from men willing to die for Allah." "Maybe," Sarah replied evenly, "but there's something you don't understand about American military training." "What is that?" Sarah's smile was cold and predatory. "We don't just train to fight people who want to live. We train to fight people who want to die. And we're very, very good at helping them achieve their goals." The psychological dynamic in the cabin shifted again as passengers heard the steel in Sarah's voice and realized that their reluctant defender wasn't intimidated by the threat of mutual destruction. If anything, she seemed energized by the challenge, as if this was exactly the kind of situation she had been preparing for her entire military career. The lead hijacker's confident expression faltered slightly as he recognized that his attempt at psychological domination had failed. Sarah wasn't going to be paralyzed by fear, and her continued resistance was inspiring the other passengers to maintain their own courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. "Last chance," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Tell the pilots to open the cockpit door, or I trigger this device and we all die together." Sarah studied his face, his posture, the way he held the apparent trigger device, drawing on years of experience in reading hostile combatants under pressure. Something wasn't quite right about his demeanor. There was desperation there, but not the serene acceptance she had seen in true suicide bombers during her deployments overseas. "No," she said simply. The single word seemed to echo through the cabin, and Sarah could see its impact on everyone present, passengers, flight attendants, and hijackers alike. In that moment, she had drawn a line in the sand and forced everyone to choose which side they were on. The lead hijacker's thumb moved toward the trigger, and Sarah tensed for what might be the final confrontation of her life. But she had made her decision, and she would live or die by it. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and this was definitely one of them. The moment stretched taut like a wire about to snap as the lead hijacker's thumb hovered over the trigger mechanism. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, the desire to complete his mission warring against the self-preservation instinct that exists in even the most dedicated fanatics. In that crucial second, she made a decision that would either save everyone on the plane or get them all killed. Instead of backing down or trying to negotiate further, Sarah took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and the apparent explosive device. Her action was so unexpected, so contrary to every logical response to the threat, that the hijacker actually pulled his hand back slightly in surprise. "You want to be a martyr?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Then do it right. Don't hide behind innocent people like some common criminal. Face me, one-on-one, and let's see if your Allah really wants you to die today." The challenge was calculated to exploit what Sarah suspected was a fundamental weakness in the hijacker's psychology. Her years of combat experience had taught her that terrorists, despite their rhetoric about martyrdom, were often fundamentally cowards who relied on overwhelming force and the element of surprise to achieve their objectives. When faced with genuine personal risk in a fair fight, many of them revealed their true nature. "You think to trick me with words? the hijacker replied, but Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. I am not afraid to die for the cause. Then prove it, Sarah shot back. Put the bomb down and fight me, hand to hand. Winner takes the plane. The audacity of her proposal sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Passengers stared in disbelief as Sarah essentially challenged a suicide bomber to single combat, apparently willing to bet everyone's lives on her ability to defeat him in a fair fight. But Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. She was forcing the hijacker to make a choice between his mission and his ego, between tactical advantage and personal honor. The stocky hijacker started to say something in Arabic, probably advising his leader to ignore the challenge and proceed with their original plan. But the lead hijacker silenced him with a sharp gesture, his attention completely focused on Sarah. She could see him weighing his options, trying to determine if this was some kind of trap or if the American woman was really foolish enough to risk everything on a single combat. You think you can defeat me? He asked, his grip on the apparent explosive device loosening slightly. I am not afraid to die. You are just a woman, no matter what training you have received. Sarah smiled, and several passengers later described the expression as absolutely terrifying. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey, the look of someone who lived for exactly this kind of confrontation. There's only one way to find out, she said, but I understand if you're too scared to face me without your toy. The insult hit its mark perfectly. Sarah could see the anger flashing in the hijacker's eyes, the wounded masculine pride that was warring with his tactical judgment. For a man who probably grew up in a culture that viewed women as inherently inferior, the suggestion that he was afraid to fight one was devastating to his self-image. Around the cabin, passengers were holding their breath as they watched this deadly psychological chess match play out. Several people had their phones out, recording what might be the final moments of their lives. Others were praying quietly, while a few seemed to be trying to compose final messages to their loved ones. The two other hijackers were looking increasingly nervous as their leader engaged in this unexpected dialogue. They had clearly not prepared for this scenario during their mission planning, and Sarah could see them exchanging worried glances as their carefully orchestrated operation continued to spiral out of their control. You want to die so badly? The lead hijacker asked, his voice taking on a mocking tone. Very well, I will grant your wish. To Sarah's satisfaction and the horror of everyone watching, he began to carefully place the apparent explosive device on the floor between them. Whether it was real or a bluff, he was apparently willing to set it aside to accept her challenge. The psychological manipulation had worked. She had successfully appealed to his pride and convinced him to abandon his position of overwhelming advantage. But as he straightened up, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken with a different kind of excitement. The device he had sent down looked realistic at first glance, but there were details that didn't quite add up to her trained eye. The wiring was too neat, the LED display too clean, and most tellingly, there was no timer counting down despite his earlier threats about triggering an explosion. Fake, she said with sudden certainty. It's a fake. The hijacker's face went pale, confirming Sarah's suspicions. The explosive device was nothing more than an elaborate prop designed to create fear and compliance among passengers and crew. It was a common terrorist tactic. The threat of mass destruction was often more effective than actual weapons when it came to controlling large groups of people. You have been acting this entire time, Sarah continued, her voice growing louder so that all the passengers could hear. These three men have no bomb, no real weapons except improvised blades, and no plan beyond frightening you into submission. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the cabin yet again. Passengers who had been paralyzed by the fear of imminent death began to straighten up in their seats, their expressions shifting from terror to anger as they realized they had been manipulated. The businessman who had stood up earlier was now moving forward again, his face grim with determination. Kill her, the stocky hijacker shouted in English, apparently abandoning any pretense of maintaining their cover story. Kill her now, before... His words were cut off as the businessman tackled him from behind, sending both men crashing into the galley area. The tall hijacker tried to come to his companion's aid, but found his path blocked by two other male passengers who had finally decided to take action. Sarah was already moving toward the lead hijacker, who was desperately trying to retrieve another weapon from his jacket. But his earlier decision to set aside the fake bomb had cost him crucial seconds, and Sarah was closing the distance with the relentless efficiency of a guided missile homing in on its target. Her first struck was a textbook combination, a feint with her left hand that drew his attention, while her right hand delivered a devastating blow to his solar plexus. The impact doubled him over, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping and vulnerable. Sarah's follow-up was immediate and brutal. Her knee came up to meet his descending face, connecting with his nose in a sickening crunch that sent blood spattering across the cabin floor. The eyes of the hijacker rolled back as he collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it effectively ended the hijacking attempt. With their leader down and the other passengers now actively fighting back, the remaining two hijackers quickly found themselves overwhelmed and subdued. "Zip ties," Sarah called out to the flight attendants. "Do you have anything we can use to secure these three?" "We have restraints in the emergency kit," one of the attendants replied, already moving toward the storage compartment. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady and professional. As the hijackers were being secured, Sarah finally allowed herself to take a deep breath and assess the situation. The immediate threat was over, but they were still at 37,000 feet with what might be significant damage to the aircraft's systems and crew. The pilots would need to be informed about the situation, and they would probably need to make an emergency landing to ensure everyone's safety. Looking around the cabin at the faces of the passengers, some crying with relief, others tending to minor injuries from the struggle, all of them looking at her with expressions of awe and gratitude, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that came at the end of a successful mission. But this hadn't been a military operation in some distant theater of war. This had been a fight for the lives of innocent civilians at 7 miles above the American heartland, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. As Sarah helped the flight attendants tend to the injured and coordinate with the cockpit crew, Sarah reflected on how sometimes the most important battles were the ones you never expected to fight. The hijackers' plan had failed completely, but the real victory belonged to the passengers who had found the courage to stand up and fight back when it mattered most. Sarah had provided the spark, but they had provided the fire that ultimately saved everyone on board Flight 447. With the 3 hijackers secured with zip ties and being watched by several determined passengers, Sarah's attention turned to the broader situation. The immediate physical threat had been neutralized, but Flight 447 was still 7 miles above the Earth, and there were numerous critical issues that needed to be addressed before anyone could truly consider themselves safe. "I need to speak with the pilots," Sarah told the senior flight attendant, a woman in her 40s named Janet, who had shown remarkable composure throughout the crisis. "They need to know the situation is under control, but we may have other problems to deal with." Janet nodded and led Sarah toward the cockpit door, which had remained securely locked throughout the entire confrontation. Sarah could see the reinforced steel and sophisticated security systems that had been installed on all commercial aircraft following the September 11th attacks. Those improvements had likely saved everyone's lives by preventing the hijackers from reaching their primary objective. "Captain Morrison, this is Janet," the flight attendant called through the intercom system. "The situation in the cabin is under control. The passenger who stopped the hijackers needs to speak with you." There was a moment of silence, then the captain's voice came through the speaker. "Janet, we've been monitoring the situation through the cabin cameras. Is everyone safe?" "We have some minor injuries, but no one was seriously hurt. The hijackers have been restrained, and the passenger who led the resistance is here to talk with you." Sarah took the handset from Janet. "Captain Morrison, this is Major Sarah Chen, U.S. Army Special Forces. The immediate threat has been neutralized, but we need to discuss our options for getting this aircraft safely on the ground." The captain's relief was evident in his voice when he responded.
Major Chen, I can't tell you how glad we are to hear that. We've been in contact with air traffic control and NORAD throughout the crisis. They're tracking our flight and have military escorts standing by. What's the status of the hijackers? 3 suspects, all secured and unconscious or semi-conscious, Sarah reported with military precision. They were armed with improvised weapons that appeared to be ceramic or plastic to avoid metal detectors. They also had what appeared to be an explosive device, but I've confirmed it was a fake, designed to create compliance through fear. Copy that, Major. Any damage to aircraft systems or injuries that require immediate medical attention. Sarah looked around the cabin, taking a quick inventory. Several passengers had minor cuts and bruises from the struggle, and the flight attendant who had been held hostage had superficial neck wounds that were already being treated by a passenger who had identified herself as an emergency room nurse. The cabin itself showed signs of the confrontation: displaced oxygen masks, scattered personal belongings, and some minor damage to seatbacks and armrests, but nothing that appeared to compromise the aircraft's structural integrity. No critical injuries and no obvious structural damage, Sarah reported, but I recommend we plan for an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. We need law enforcement and medical personnel standing by, and these suspects need to be turned over to federal authorities for interrogation. Agreed, Major. We're currently over eastern Utah, about 20 minutes out from Salt Lake City International. I'm going to begin our descent and approach for an emergency landing. Air traffic control has already cleared the airspace and alerted emergency services. As the captain began coordinating with air traffic control for the emergency landing, Sarah turned her attention to the passengers. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed dramatically from the terror and chaos of the hijacking attempt to a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a strange sort of camaraderie that develops among people who have shared a traumatic experience. The businessman who had tackled the stocky hijacker was sitting in an aisle seat, nursing a bruised shoulder but grinning broadly. "I can't believe we actually did it," he said to no one in particular. "When I got on this plane this morning, I never imagined I'd be fighting terrorists before lunch." "You did great," Sarah told him, offering her hand. "What's your name?" "Mike Peterson," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I played football at Nebraska 20 years ago, but I never hit anyone as hard as I hit that guy. What about you? I mean, where did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah gave him a brief summary of her military background, which led to a crowd of passengers gathering around her with questions and expressions of gratitude. She found herself in the unexpected role of celebrity hero, something that made her slightly uncomfortable. In her world, successful missions were measured by the absence of casualties and the completion of objectives, not by personal recognition or praise. The lead hijacker was beginning to regain consciousness, his eyes opening slowly as he struggled to focus on his surroundings. Sarah knelt down beside him, speaking in a voice that only he could hear. "Your mission failed," she said quietly. "Your accomplices are going to spend the rest of their lives in American prisons, and whatever organization sent you is going to have to explain why they wasted 3 assets on such a poorly planned operation." The hijacker's expression closed off immediately, and Sarah knew she wouldn't get any more information from him without proper interrogation techniques and facilities. But his momentary admission suggested that their hijacking attempt had been based on intelligence about potential resistance they might face, intelligence that had proven to be woefully inadequate. As Flight 447 began its descent towards Salt Lake City, Sarah reflected on the implications of what had just occurred. This hadn't been a random act of terrorism, but part of a larger planned operation. The hijackers had mentioned burning the towers of American capitalism again, suggesting they were connected to a broader network with ambitious and devastating goals. Janet, the senior flight attendant, approached her with a concerned expression. "Major Chen, we're getting reports from air traffic control that there may be other incidents occurring simultaneously. They're asking if any of the hijackers said anything that might indicate coordinated attacks." Sarah's blood ran cold as she considered the possibilities. If this hijacking had been part of a larger plot involving multiple aircraft or targets, then stopping these 3 men might have just been the beginning of a much larger crisis. She quickly reviewed everything the hijackers had said during the confrontation, looking for any clues about the scope and timing of potential additional attacks. They mentioned towers burning again and suggested this was just the beginning of a larger operation. Sarah told Janet, "Get me back on the radio with the captain. We need to pass that information to the authorities immediately." As Janet handed her the handset, Sarah could see the lights of Salt Lake City beginning to appear in the distance. They were less than 15 minutes from landing, but she had a growing sense that the real crisis might just be beginning. The hijacking of Flight 447 had been thwarted, but if it was indeed part of a coordinated attack, then law enforcement and military forces across the country might be dealing with multiple simultaneous threats. "Captain Morrison, this is Major Chen again. I have intelligence suggesting this hijacking may have been part of a coordinated attack involving multiple targets. The suspects made references to burning American landmarks and indicated this was just the beginning of a larger operation." "Copy that, Major. I'm relaying that information to air traffic control immediately. They'll pass it up the chain to NORAD and the FBI. We are also being told that F-16s from Hill Air Force Base are providing escort for our final approach. Apparently, they're taking no chances that we might still be under hostile control." Looking out the windows, Sarah could indeed see the distinctive silhouettes of military fighter aircraft flanking their commercial airliner. The sight was both reassuring and sobering. It meant that the authorities were taking the threat seriously, but it also reminded everyone that they were still potentially under danger until the aircraft was safely on the ground and the suspects were in custody. The passengers had noticed the military escort as well, and the cabin filled with a mixture of excited chatter and nervous energy. Children were pointing at the fighter jets, while adults took pictures with their phones and called loved ones to report that they were safe and approaching Salt Lake City. Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of what had just occurred. The post-9/11 security measures had prevented the hijackers from bringing conventional weapons aboard the aircraft, but they had still managed to create a serious threat using improvised weapons and psychological manipulation. Their plan ultimately failed because they had underestimated the resistance they would face, but a more competent team might have succeeded. The fact that they had specifically targeted Flight 447, a routine domestic flight with no obvious strategic value, suggested that their real objective might have been to create fear and chaos rather than to strike a specific symbolic target. That kind of psychological terrorism could be even more devastating than direct attacks because it undermined people's sense of safety in ordinary, everyday situations. As the aircraft continued its descent and the lights of Salt Lake City grew brighter outside the windows, Sarah began to mentally prepare for what would certainly be an extensive debriefing process. Federal investigators would want to know every detail of the confrontation, every word the hijackers had spoken, every clue that might help identify their network and prevent future attacks. But for now, her primary concern was ensuring that everyone aboard Flight 447 reached the ground safely. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work of understanding and responding to the broader threat was just beginning.
The descent into Salt Lake City International Airport was unlike anything the passengers of Flight 447 had ever experienced. As they approached the runway, they could see the massive emergency response that had been assembled on the ground. Fire trucks, ambulances, police vehicles, and what appeared to be federal agents in black SUVs forming a perimeter around their designated landing area. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom as they made their final approach. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're about to touch down at Salt Lake City International Airport, where emergency services are standing by as a precautionary measure. I want to thank Major Chen and all the passengers who showed such courage during today's incident. You should all be proud of how you responded to an impossible situation." The landing was smooth and professional, but as soon as the aircraft's wheels touched the runway, Sarah could see additional security measures being implemented. The F-16 escort aircraft maintained their formation until the commercial airliner had come to a complete stop, and she noticed that the entire airport appeared to have been cleared of other traffic to accommodate their emergency arrival. "Major Chen," Janet said, approaching her with a phone, "the FBI wants to speak with you immediately. They're coordinating with military authorities about the intelligence you provided." Sarah took the phone and found herself speaking with Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. "Major, this is Agent Martinez. First, let me say that your actions today likely saved hundreds of lives.
Second, we need to debrief you immediately about any intelligence you gathered from the suspects. Understood, Agent Martinez. What can you tell me about potential coordinated attacks? The suspects made specific references to multiple targets and suggested this was part of a larger operation. There was a brief pause before the agent responded. We're investigating several suspicious incidents that occurred around the same time as your hijacking attempt. Nothing as serious as what you faced, but enough to suggest this may have been part of a coordinated probe of our security systems. As the aircraft taxied to a remote gate area, Sarah could see the extensive law enforcement presence that had been assembled. Dozens of agents in tactical gear were positioned around the aircraft, while bomb disposal experts prepared to examine the fake explosive device and any other potential threats. The passengers were informed that they would be evacuated in small groups for security screening and debriefing. Priority would be given to anyone requiring medical attention, followed by the passengers who had directly participated in subduing the hijackers. I want to thank all of you, Sarah announced to the cabin before the evacuation began. What happened today was extraordinary. You faced a terrifying situation, and when it mattered most, you found the courage to fight back. That's the best of America right there. The response from the passengers was immediate and emotional. Several people began applauding, and Sarah found herself surrounded by passengers wanting to shake her hand, take pictures, or simply say thank you. Mike Peterson, the businessman who had tackled one of the hijackers, grabbed her in a bear hug. I'm going to tell my kids about this for the rest of my life, the day their dad fought terrorists with a genuine American hero. As the evacuation began, Sarah made sure to stay close to the restrained hijackers. Even though they were unconscious or semi-conscious and securely bound, her training told her never to assume a threat was completely neutralized until it was properly contained by appropriate authorities. The lead hijacker had regained full consciousness and was watching the evacuation process with cold calculation. She could see him mentally cataloging details, the response procedures, the number of agents, the types of equipment being used. Even in defeat, he was gathering intelligence that might be valuable to his organization. See something interesting? Sarah asked him quietly as federal agents prepared to remove him from the aircraft. You see that America is afraid, he replied, his English clearer now that he was fully alert. Look at all this. Hundreds of agents, military aircraft, an entire airport shut down because of 3 men with plastic knives? No, Sarah corrected him, because of 3 terrorists who threatened innocent people. This isn't fear, it's the appropriate response to a credible threat. Your mistake was thinking that Americans would just sit quietly while you tried to hurt them. The hijacker's expression shifted to something that might have been confusion. You are military. You understand war. But these others, civilians, soft people living comfortable lives, why did they fight? Why did they risk themselves for strangers? Sarah realized that this question revealed something fundamental about the terrorist worldview and their failure to understand American culture. They had planned their operation based on the assumption that civilian passengers would be paralyzed by fear and unwilling to risk themselves for others.
Because that's who we are, Sarah said simply. When someone threatens our neighbors, our fellow citizens, people we've never met before, we stand up. We don't wait for someone else to solve the problem. That's what you didn't understand about America.
Federal agents were now boarding the aircraft to take custody of the suspects. Sarah provided them with a quick briefing about each hijacker's condition and the weapons that had been confiscated, then prepared to accompany them off the aircraft for her own debriefing. As she walked down the jet bridge, Sarah was surprised to see a familiar figure waiting for her. Colonel James Harrison, her commanding officer from the 5th Special Forces Group. He was out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes, but his bearing and expression were unmistakably military. Sarah, he said, extending his hand, hell of a thing. When I got the call that one of my officers had single-handedly stopped a hijacking, I had to come see for myself. Colonel Harrison? How did you get here so fast? I was already in Salt Lake City for a conference at SOCOM West. When the FBI reached out to verify your identity and background, they contacted me directly. I've been coordinating with federal authorities about your debrief and what happens next. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because she would be dealing with people who understood her background and training, but apprehension because the presence of her commanding officer suggested that this incident was being taken very seriously at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. What's the bigger picture, Colonel?
The hijackers made references to coordinated attacks and multiple targets. Colonel Harrison's expression grew grim. We're still piecing that together, but it looks like you interrupted something significant. There were at least 4 other suspicious incidents today involving commercial aviation. Nothing as serious as what you faced, but enough to suggest a coordinated probe of our security systems. As they walked through the terminal, Sarah could see the extensive media presence that had assembled outside the airport. News vans from every major network were positioned behind security barriers, and she could hear reporters doing live broadcasts about the heroic Special Forces officer who had stopped a terrorist attack. "Colonel, I need you to know that this wasn't just me," Sarah said firmly. "The passengers on that flight, they're the real heroes. Once they understood what was happening, they stood up and fought. I just gave them the confidence to act." "That's exactly what I expected you to say," Colonel Harrison replied with a slight smile. "And it's exactly why you're going to handle the media attention that's coming your way with the professionalism and humility that reflects well on the unit and the Army." Sarah realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The successful resolution of the hijacking attempt would undoubtedly make her a public figure, at least temporarily, and she would need to navigate that attention while continuing to serve as a military officer. But her immediate concern was the intelligence gathering process that lay ahead. The hijackers had revealed enough information to suggest a larger threat, and every detail of their conversation and behavior needed to be analyzed for clues about potential future attacks. As they approached the secure debriefing facility that had been established at the airport, Sarah took a deep breath and mentally prepared for what would likely be many hours of detailed questioning. She had successfully completed the tactical phase of this crisis, but the intelligence phase was just beginning. The real measure of success wouldn't be the media coverage or the personal recognition, but whether the information she had gathered could be used to prevent future attacks and protect other innocent people. That was the mission that truly mattered, and Sarah was determined to see it through to completion.
The debriefing facility established at Salt Lake City International Airport was a study in organized chaos. FBI agents, military intelligence officers, Homeland Security officials, and representatives from various other agencies had converged to extract every possible detail from the hijacking incident. Sarah found herself at the center of what appeared to be the most intensive intelligence gathering operation she had ever witnessed outside of active combat zones. The primary debriefing room contained a conference table surrounded by nearly a dozen officials, each representing different aspects of the investigation. Agent Martinez led the FBI contingent, while Colonel Harrison represented military interests. Sarah noticed representatives from the Transportation Security Administration, the National Security Agency, and what appeared to be several analysts from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Major Chen, Agent Martinez began, "We're going to walk through every minute of the incident, from the moment you first noticed suspicious behavior until the aircraft landed. But first, let me brief you on what we've discovered about the broader situation." Sarah leaned forward, eager to understand the context of what she had experienced. Agent Martinez activated a large display screen that showed a map of the United States with several locations marked in red. At approximately the same time as your hijacking incident, we recorded 4 other suspicious events involving commercial aviation, Agent Martinez explained. A passenger on a flight from Miami to Atlanta attempted to force entry into the cockpit, but was subdued by flight attendants. Another passenger on a Los Angeles to Seattle flight was observed conducting what appeared to be surveillance of aircraft security procedures. 2 additional incidents involved passengers asking unusual questions about flight operations and emergency protocols. None of these incidents alone would have triggered a major response, added a CIA analyst whose name Sarah hadn't caught. But occurring simultaneously with your hijacking attempt, they form a clear pattern of coordinated intelligence gathering. Colonel Harrison spoke up from across the table. "The working theory is that your flight was selected as the primary target for an actual hijacking attempt, while the other incidents were designed to test our response capabilities and gather intelligence about security procedures." Sarah processed this information, considering its implications. So they were using multiple flights to probe our defenses simultaneously, with the expectation that most attempts would fail, but provide valuable intelligence for future operations. Exactly, Agent Martinez confirmed.
Your successful resistance likely prevented not just the immediate threat to Flight 447, but potentially disrupted a much larger intelligence gathering operation that could have been used to plan future attacks. The debriefing process that followed was exhaustive and methodical. Sarah recounted every detail she could remember, from her initial observations of suspicious behavior to the final moments when the hijackers were restrained. The officials were particularly interested in every word the terrorists had spoken, every reference to their organization or objectives, and any clues about their training and preparation. The lead hijacker's English was too good to be self-taught, observed a linguistics expert from the NSA. He had formal training, probably in a Western country or international school. His accent suggests Middle Eastern origin, but with educational influences that indicate extended exposure to American or British English. His combat training was also sophisticated, Sarah added. He knew advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques and demonstrated tactical awareness consistent with military or paramilitary experience. This wasn't some radicalized amateur. He was a trained operative. The session continued for over 3 hours, with officials taking turns asking questions and seeking clarification on specific points. Sarah found herself drawing detailed diagrams of the aircraft cabin, marking the positions of passengers and hijackers throughout the incident. She also provided physical descriptions of the improvised weapons and the fake explosive device that had been used to intimidate passengers. During a break in the formal debriefing, Colonel Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Sarah, I need you to understand that this incident is going to have significant implications for your career. The media attention alone is going to be substantial, but beyond that, you've become a valuable intelligence asset yourself." "What do you mean, Colonel?" "You've had direct contact with sophisticated terrorists in a combat situation. You've observed their tactics, their equipment, their psychological operations, and their organizational structure. That makes you one of the few people who can provide first-hand insights into how these groups operate." Sarah realized that her commanding officer was preparing her for a fundamental change in her military role. Instead of conducting operations against terrorists overseas, she might find herself working with intelligence agencies to understand and counter terrorist tactics within the United States. "There's something else," Colonel Harrison continued. "The passengers on your flight, they're going to be debriefed as well, but several of them have specifically requested to speak with you again. Apparently, the experience of fighting back against terrorists has been transformative for some of them." When Sarah returned to the debriefing room, she learned that Mike Peterson, the businessman who had tackled one of the hijackers, had requested permission to make a statement. He was brought into the room and took a seat at the conference table, still wearing the same clothes from the flight, but now bearing visible bruises from his confrontation with the terrorist. "I wanted to thank Major Chen again," Peterson said, addressing the room full of officials. "But more than that, I wanted to make sure everyone understands what really happened on that flight. It wasn't just one person being heroic. It was ordinary Americans discovering that they didn't have to be victims." His statement resonated with everyone in the room. Peterson continued, "When those terrorists tried to take control of our aircraft, they were counting on us being too scared to resist. But Major Chen showed us that they were just men, not some unstoppable force. Once we realized that, everything changed." Agent Martinez asked Peterson to describe his decision-making process during the incident, and his response provided valuable insights into the psychology of passenger resistance. "At first, I was terrified like everyone else," he admitted. "But when I saw this woman, Major Chen, standing up to them and refusing to be intimidated, something clicked. I realized that if she could fight, so could I." After Peterson's statement, Sarah was asked to provide her assessment of passenger behavior and resistance potential. "What I observed," she said carefully, "was that civilian passengers are capable of extraordinary courage when they understand the nature of the threat they are facing and believe they have a chance of success. The key factors were information and leadership. Once passengers realized the explosive device was fake and saw that the hijackers could be defeated, they were willing to take risks to protect themselves and others. But they needed someone to take the first action and show them it was possible." The debriefing session concluded with a discussion of potential policy implications and security improvements. Sarah's experience had demonstrated both the continued vulnerability of commercial aviation and the potential effectiveness of passenger resistance when properly motivated and led. As the meeting ended, Agent Martinez approached Sarah with the final question. Major, given everything you've experienced today, what would you identify as the most important lesson for preventing future incidents like this? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. The most important lesson is that terrorists succeed through fear and intimidation, not just through weapons and tactics. When we refuse to be intimidated, when we stand up and fight back, their entire operational model collapses. They planned this attack based on assumptions about American passivity and fear. They assumed that civilian passengers would freeze and comply with their demands. Their fundamental miscalculation was underestimating the courage of ordinary Americans when their safety and freedom are threatened. As Sarah left the debriefing facility, she reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. The hijacking attempt had failed not just because of her military training, but because of the collective courage of passengers who refused to accept the role of victims that the terrorists had assigned to them. The real victory was not just the successful defense of Flight 447, it was the demonstration that terrorism's primary weapon, fear, could be defeated by ordinary people who chose to stand up and fight back. That lesson would be far more valuable than any intelligence gathered from the captured hijackers.
The immediate aftermath of the Flight 447 incident unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated military operation. Within hours of the aircraft's emergency landing, the captured hijackers had been transferred to a secure federal facility. The passengers had been processed through security screenings and medical evaluations, and Sarah found herself at the center of a media firestorm that was spreading across national and international news networks. The secure conference room where Sarah met with senior officials had been transformed into a command center for what was being called Operation Skywatch, a comprehensive review of aviation security in light of the coordinated attacks. Multiple large screens displayed real-time intelligence reports, flight tracking data, and news coverage from around the world. Major Chen, said Director Patricia Wells from the Department of Homeland Security, who had arrived from Washington via military transport, the President has asked me to convey his personal gratitude for your actions today. You prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack and provided intelligence that may prevent future incidents. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention and praise, but she understood that her role had evolved beyond that of a simple passenger who had defended herself and others. She had become a symbol of American resilience and a valuable source of intelligence about terrorist tactics and capabilities. Director Wells, what can you tell me about the other incidents? Were they all connected to the same organization? We're still analyzing the connections, but preliminary evidence suggests a coordinated operation designed to test our response capabilities while gathering intelligence for future attacks, Director Wells replied. Your hijackers were the primary assault team, while the passengers on the other flights were conducting surveillance and probing security procedures. Agent Martinez added new information to the briefing. We've identified the lead hijacker as Khalid al-Rashid, a former Iraqi military officer who disappeared from a prisoner of war camp in 2008. The other two suspects are still being processed, but initial indicators suggest they're part of a sophisticated network with international connections. The scope and complexity of the threat was becoming clearer with each new piece of information. This hadn't been a spontaneous act of terrorism, but a carefully planned operation that had required months or years of preparation, coordination, and infiltration of American aviation security systems. Colonel Harrison provided a military perspective on the intelligence gathering process. Sarah, your observations about their training and tactics have been invaluable. The way you described their coordination and use of psychological operations matches patterns we've seen in sophisticated terrorist networks operating in other theaters. What's our next step? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Director Wells leaned forward, her expression serious. Major Chen, we'd like you to consider a temporary assignment to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Your first-hand experience with these tactics and your ability to analyze terrorist psychology would be extremely valuable in preventing future attacks.
The offer wasn't entirely surprising, but it represented a significant change from Sarah's current role in Special Forces. Instead of conducting operations overseas, she would be working within the United States to analyze and counter terrorist threats to civilian targets. "I'd need to discuss this with my chain of command," Sarah replied diplomatically, "but I'm willing to consider how I can best serve the mission." Before the meeting could continue, an aide rushed into the room with urgent news. "Director Wells, we're receiving reports of similar coordinated probes in European airports. London, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam have all reported suspicious passengers exhibiting behavior patterns identical to what we saw today." The revelation sent a chill through the room as officials realized they were dealing with a truly international operation. The Flight 447 hijacking hadn't been an isolated incident targeting American aviation. It was part of a global intelligence gathering operation that could be preparing for simultaneous attacks across multiple countries. "This changes everything," Agent Martinez said grimly. "We're not just dealing with a domestic threat. This is a coordinated international operation that could be preparing for something far larger than individual aircraft hijackings." Sarah's mind immediately went to the implications for global aviation security. If terrorist networks were simultaneously probing security systems in multiple countries, they might be planning coordinated attacks that could ground commercial aviation worldwide and cause unprecedented economic and social disruption. "We need to contact our international partners immediately," Director Wells said, reaching for her secure phone. "If they're seeing similar patterns, we need to coordinate our response and share intelligence in real time."
As officials began making urgent phone calls and coordinating with international agencies, Sarah found herself thinking about the passengers from Flight 447. They had returned to their normal lives, probably never fully understanding that they had participated in preventing what might have been a much larger catastrophe. Mike Peterson, the businessman who had tackled one of the hijackers, had given her his business card before leaving the airport. "If you ever need anything," he had said, "anything at all, you call me. I owe you my life and probably the lives of everyone on that plane." Similar sentiments had been expressed by virtually every passenger Sarah had spoken with during the evacuation and debriefing process. The shared experience of facing mortal danger and fighting back had created bonds between complete strangers that would likely last for years to come. The young flight attendant who had been held hostage, Jennifer Walsh, had been particularly affected by the experience. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that flight," she had told Sarah during her medical evaluation. "Those passengers wouldn't have known they could fight back. We all would have died, or worse." The "or worse" possibility was something that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. The hijackers' references to turning commercial aircraft into weapons against American targets brought back memories of September 11th and raised the specter of even more devastating attacks if similar operations succeeded in the future. As the evening briefing session concluded, Sarah was approached by a man she hadn't previously met. Dr. Michael Harrison from the CIA's Behavioral Analysis Unit. "Major Chen, I've been studying the psychological profiles of the hijackers based on your observations and the debriefing transcripts. There's something I think you should know." "What is it, Dr. Harrison?" "The lead hijacker's behavior patterns suggest he was specifically trained to counter American military resistance. His tactical responses to your actions were too sophisticated to be improvised. He had been prepared to face someone with your level of training." The implication was chilling. If terrorist networks were specifically preparing their operatives to counter trained military personnel on commercial flights, it suggested they expected to encounter resistance from off-duty service members on commercial flights. That level of tactical preparation indicated a threat far more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. "They knew," Sarah said with growing certainty. "They knew there might be military personnel on civilian flights, and they trained for it." "That's our assessment," Dr. Harrison confirmed.
which means your success today wasn't just about superior training or tactics. It was about doing something they hadn't planned for. You didn't just resist their attack, you completely disrupted their operational psychology. As Sarah left the secure facility and prepared to return to her hotel, she reflected on how much the world had changed in the span of a single day. She had boarded Flight 447 that morning as a Special Forces officer on leave, looking forward to visiting her sister and meeting her newborn nephew. Now she was at the center of an international terrorism investigation that might reshape aviation security around the world. The media attention was intense and unavoidable. News vans lined the street outside her hotel, and reporters shouted questions as she walked quickly through the lobby. But Sarah had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, and she maintained her composure while avoiding any statements that might compromise the ongoing investigation. In her hotel room that evening, Sarah finally had a chance to call her sister and explain why she wouldn't be arriving in Los Angeles as planned. The conversation was emotional and difficult. Her sister was simultaneously proud of her actions and terrified by how close she had come to losing her. "I saw the news coverage," her sister said through tears. "When they said there had been a hijacking and showed the picture of the plane, I thought I might never see you again." "I'm okay," Sarah reassured her. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing what I've trained to do. That's all any of us can do. Be ready when we're needed." As she prepared for what would undoubtedly be another long day of briefings and analysis, Sarah realized that her military career had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated. The skills that had served her in combat zones around the world were now needed to protect the homeland itself, and she was determined to rise to that challenge.
6 months after the Flight 447 incident, Major Sarah Chen stood before a joint session of Congress, delivering testimony that would fundamentally reshape American aviation security policy. The hearing room was packed with lawmakers, media representatives, and families of the passengers whose lives had been saved that day at 37,000 feet above the American heartland. The events of that Tuesday morning demonstrated both our vulnerabilities and our greatest strength, Sarah testified, her voice carrying clearly through the chambers. The terrorists succeeded in bypassing our security systems with improvised weapons, but they failed to account for the courage and resilience of the American people. The investigation that had followed the hijacking attempt had revealed the full scope of what became known as Operation Skywatch, a coordinated international effort by terrorist networks to simultaneously probe aviation security systems in the United States, Europe, and Asia. The intelligence gathered from the captured hijackers and their international accomplices had led to the disruption of terrorist cells in 7 countries and the prevention of what analysts estimated could have been the largest coordinated attack since September 11th. Sarah's role in the months following the incident had evolved far beyond her original military specialization. Working with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, she had helped develop new training programs for flight crews and law enforcement officers, focusing on the psychological aspects of terrorist operations and the potential for passenger resistance. The key insight from Flight 447, she continued in her testimony, was that terrorists rely on fear and the assumption of victim compliance to achieve their objectives. When passengers understand that they have the power to resist and the support to succeed, the entire terrorist operational model collapses. Her words carried special weight because they were backed by results. In the 6 months since the incident, there had been 3 additional attempted hijackings on international flights, all of which had been thwarted by passenger resistance inspired by the Flight 447 example. The Sarah Chen protocol, as it had become known in aviation security circles, had been adopted by airlines worldwide. The protocol was simple but revolutionary. Instead of instructing passengers to remain passive during hijacking attempts, flight crews were now trained to quickly assess the nature of threats and, when appropriate, coordinate passenger resistance. The key was providing passengers with accurate information about the threats they faced and clear leadership during crisis situations. Mike Peterson, the businessman who had tackled one of the hijackers on Flight 447, had become an unexpected advocate for passenger rights and aviation security reform.
He testified before the same congressional committee about the transformation he had experienced that day. Before Flight 447, I thought of myself as just another business traveler. I would have been exactly the kind of passive victim the terrorists were counting on. But when Major Chen showed us that we didn't have to be victims, everything changed. Not just for that day, but for the rest of my life. Peterson had used his experience to establish a foundation that provided self-defense training for civilian travelers and worked with aviation authorities to develop better passenger communication systems for emergency situations. His foundation had already trained over 10,000 people in basic security awareness and emergency response techniques. The ripple effects of the Flight 447 incident extended far beyond aviation security. Sarah's actions had sparked a broader conversation about preparedness, resilience, and the role of ordinary citizens in homeland security. Self-defense courses had seen a surge in enrollment. Community emergency response teams had grown dramatically, and there was a renewed sense among Americans that they had both the responsibility and the capability to protect themselves and their neighbors. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant who had been held hostage during the hijacking attempt, had also transformed her traumatic experience into positive action. She had become a trainer for flight crew emergency response and worked with airlines to develop better protocols for dealing with onboard threats. The most important thing we learned, Jennifer told a gathering of aviation professionals, was that our passengers are not helpless. They're not just people we need to protect, they're potential allies in keeping everyone safe. The international cooperation that had emerged from the investigation had led to unprecedented intelligence sharing and coordinated security measures. The European incidents that had been discovered on the day of the hijacking had been part of the same network, and the coordinated response had disrupted terrorist operations across 3 continents. Sarah's temporary assignment to the Joint Terrorism Task Force had become permanent with her promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment to a newly created position focused on domestic counterterrorism and civilian resilience. Her unique experience as both a combat veteran and a civilian terrorism target gave her insights that proved invaluable in developing comprehensive security strategies. The 3 hijackers from Flight 447 had been sentenced to life in prison without parole after pleading guilty to terrorism charges. The intelligence gathered during their interrogation had led to the identification and capture of over 50 additional suspects worldwide, dealing a significant blow to the terrorist network that had planned Operation Skywatch. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the incident was the change in national consciousness about terrorism and security. The Flight 447 story had become a symbol of American resilience and the power of ordinary citizens to make extraordinary differences in crisis situations. Sarah's sister had finally met her hero sister in person when Sarah was able to take leave and visit Los Angeles 3 weeks after the incident. The reunion was emotional and profound, with Sarah finally getting to hold her newborn nephew, a moment that provided perspective on what she was really fighting to protect. "He's gonna grow up in a world that's different because of what you did," her sister had said, tears streaming down her face as she watched Sarah cradle the baby. "He's going to grow up knowing that Americans don't surrender to bullies, no matter how scary they try to be."
As Sarah concluded her congressional testimony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a routine military career to becoming an unlikely symbol of civilian courage and resistance. The transformation hadn't been something she had sought, but it was a responsibility she had embraced fully. The lesson of Flight 447, she told the lawmakers in her closing statement, is not that we need more heroes. It's that heroism exists within ordinary Americans when they understand what's at stake and believe they can make a difference. Our job as leaders and policymakers is to give them the tools and information they need to act when their moment comes. The standing ovation that followed her testimony lasted nearly 5 minutes, with lawmakers from both parties rising to acknowledge not just her actions on that Tuesday morning 6 months earlier, but the ongoing work she was doing to make the country safer and more resilient. Outside the Capitol building, Sarah was approached by reporters for the inevitable questions and follow-up interviews, but she had learned to handle media attention with the same professionalism and focus she brought to military operations. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, do you consider yourself a hero? Sarah paused before answering, choosing her words carefully. I consider myself an American who did what needed to be done when it needed to be done. The real heroes are the passengers who chose to stand up and fight when they could have stayed in their seats. The real heroes are the first responders and investigators who turned one prevented attack into the disruption of an entire terrorist network. As she walked away from the Capitol building, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Mike Peterson. "Watching your testimony on C-SPAN, you nailed it. Proud to have fought alongside you that day." Similar messages poured in from other Flight 447 passengers, flight crew members, and law enforcement officials who had worked on the investigation. The bonds formed during those terrifying moments at 37,000 feet had created a lasting network of people committed to the principle that ordinary Americans would never again be passive victims of terrorist attacks. The hijackers had thought she would be an easy target that Tuesday morning. Instead, they had encountered their worst nightmare, an American who refused to be intimidated, who inspired others to resist, and who turned their carefully planned operation into a complete disaster that ultimately led to the destruction of their entire network. The story of Flight 447 had become more than just a successful counterterrorism operation. It had become a reminder that the true strength of America lay not in its weapons or technology, but in the courage and determination of its people when faced with those who would threaten their freedom and safety. Sarah's journey from Special Forces operator to symbol of civilian resilience was far from over, but she faced the future with the same confidence and determination that had carried her through that life-changing confrontation 7 miles above the earth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that Americans would be ready to meet them with courage, unity, and an absolute refusal to surrender to fear.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.